Blind
Thank
date
you. So
mix-up?
do you.
The poor baker sat at the wrong table, and the CEO's daughter wouldn't let him leave. Imagine this. You're an ordinary baker who accidentally sits at the wrong table. Across from you is the daughter of a very wealthy man. You want to stand up, you want to tell the truth, but she looks at you the way no one has in a very long time. And sometimes, the most dangerous mistake in life is the one that feels right. Evan Brooks had always believed that small things mattered. The perfect swirl of frosting, the way sunlight touched the glass window of his bakery every morning, the laughter that occasionally filled the quiet between kneading dough and serving coffee. Yet lately, even those small things had begun to slip through his fingers. His bakery, a little corner shop tucked between aging brick buildings in Chicago's quieter streets, was losing its warmth. Bills stacked like forgotten recipes. Flour prices had doubled. Rent notices arrived with sharper edges. His once bustling mornings now echoed with the hollow hum of a broken refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath his tired steps. He wasn't the kind of man who complained. Evan carried his burdens the way he kneaded his dough, with patience, steady rhythm, and quiet faith that something good might rise again. His best friend, Oliver, had grown tired of watching him live inside those walls of routine sorrow. So one Thursday night, over a half-eaten pizza and stories of better days, Oliver pushed Evan's phone toward him and said, "You need to meet someone." Evan laughed it off at first, but Oliver had already set him up. A blind date, a simple evening meant to make him remember that life still offered warmth beyond ovens and invoices. The cafe was livelier than he'd imagined. Light jazz, the faint aroma of roasted beans, and the clinking of glass created a rhythm that almost calmed him. Evan scanned the crowd for the woman Oliver described. Brown coat, bright smile. But as he approached the front desk, a misunderstanding waited. The hostess glanced at the reservation list, misheard the name, and led him to a window table where a woman sat poised, elegant, absorbed in her phone. Lila Grant didn't notice him at first. When she looked up, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to recognition, or at least, what she believed was recognition. "Hi," she said warmly. "You're early." Evan, unsure but too kind to correct her, smiled nervously and took his seat. Something about her confidence disarmed him. Lila spoke with a smoothness born of boardrooms and banquets, not bakeries and broken cash registers. Her every gesture felt precise, deliberate, as if the world had always made room for her. He listened, captivated by her stories of art galleries and travel, pretending he belonged in those words. Yet beneath his calm exterior, his heart thrummed with the unease of an imposter. Across from her, Lila was equally intrigued. There was something refreshing about this man. Quieter than the men she usually met, grounded in a way she couldn't define. She mistook his modest pauses for confidence, his shy smile for mystery. For the first time in months, her evening didn't feel like another social obligation. It felt human, unguarded. When the waiter arrived, Evan ordered simple, coffee, no sugar. Lila followed with her usual latte. The moment the waiter walked away, her curiosity deepened. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching his face for familiarity. "So," she began, "how did the meeting with my father go?" The question struck like cold air through an open door. Evan's pulse stumbled. His hands froze mid-motion. He realized then, the name mix-up, the mistaken table, her easy confidence, it all clicked into place. She wasn't meeting a stranger. She was waiting for someone else entirely. And in that heartbeat of silence as confusion flickered between them, fate quietly rewrote two lives that had never meant to cross. Sometimes lies aren't born of malice but of awe. When someone feels seen for the first time, Evan's first instinct was to correct her, to clear the confusion before it deepened. But as the question hung between them, soft, curious, utterly trusting, something in him hesitated. He saw in her eyes not suspicion but warmth, not expectation but faith. For a man who had spent months unseen, his name forgotten even by customers who once greeted him daily, that simple look of recognition felt like sunlight after a long winter. So he did what his heart foolishly whispered. He stayed silent and nodded, not in deceit, but in a strange, aching kindness. The lie wasn't elegant, nor was it planned. It came from the part of Evan that still believed in second chances, even borrowed ones. He told himself it was just for tonight, a harmless misunderstanding, a brief escape from a life of bills and broken ovens. Lila smiled, relieved by his unspoken confirmation, and the evening carried them forward before honesty could catch up. Conversation became the bridge between two strangers standing on borrowed ground. Lila spoke of her work at a nonprofit she'd started quietly beneath her father's corporate shadow, a project meant to bring food to low-income neighborhoods. She confessed how exhausting it felt to live in a world that valued profits over people. Evan listened, his heart tightening at her sincerity. He saw in her words the reflection of his own dreams, to bake. Not for wealth, but for warmth. To offer bread as a gesture of care rather than currency. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, pretending to be someone else, yet feeling more understood than he had in years. As laughter spilled across their table, it mingled with the cafe's golden light. The amber hue softened Lila's sharp confidence into something gentler, and Evan's nervousness into quiet wonder. They spoke of music, of the smell of rain on pavement, of how certain songs could still make them ache for places they'd never been. Their hands brushed once when reaching for the same sugar packet, and though neither mentioned it, the air between them shifted, not in romance yet, but in recognition. Two hearts bruised by loneliness had found, however briefly, a rhythm that made sense. Somewhere between dessert and closing time, Evan remembered his childhood, the tiny bakery his mother once ran in a forgotten neighborhood on the city's south side. He'd been no taller than the counter, yet he'd wake before dawn just to help her knead dough. She used to tell him that every loaf carried a prayer, that feeding someone was an act of love disguised as labor. When she passed, that belief became his compass. But dreams, he learned, were fragile things. They cracked under the weight of rent notices and cold seasons. Still, every loaf he baked since had carried her words like yeast, something unseen but alive rising in silence. He shared that story with Lila, leaving out names and places, offering it instead as a metaphor. She listened intently, her eyes glimmering with a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "My mother used to say kindness is just love practiced in small moments." For a second, Evan almost confessed everything, his name, his mistake, the truth of how this meeting wasn't his to claim. But her smile disarmed him again, that gentle curve that made him feel, perhaps for the first time in years, like he belonged. Outside, snow had begun to fall, brushing against the cafe windows in delicate flakes. The city blurred into a haze of headlights and reflections, as though even the world conspired to soften what wasn't meant to last. When Lila's phone buzzed, she glanced at it, the glow of the screen illuminating the faint crease of worry between her brows. Her father's name flashed across the display. She hesitated, then answered. "Hi, Dad," she said lightly. "Yes, I'm with him now. Everything's going well." Evan froze, the weight of his lie pressing against his chest. He caught fragments of her father's voice through the faint hum of the cafe's background noise. Questions about the executive, about plans, about promises. Lila smiled to reassure him, not noticing the color drain from Evan's face. When she ended the call with a contented sigh and said, "He's happy you finally met," Evan's throat tightened, because in that single sentence the lie he'd borrowed out of kindness began to crumble beneath the truth he could no longer avoid. Every secret has its echo, and it always returns louder than the truth. Evan didn't sleep that night. The echo of Lila's voice lingered in his head like the aftertaste of something too sweet to forget, too heavy to keep. He replayed every word, every glance, every heartbeat of that evening until dawn painted the streets of Chicago in a pale, forgiving light. Yet forgiveness felt far from reach. The warmth he had borrowed through his lie was already cooling into shame. By morning, his bakery smelled of burnt dough, the oven timer screaming as if scolding him for losing focus. He stared at the loaves inside, blackened at the edges, realizing that deceit, no matter how small, always left something scorched in its wake. The next evening, as the city hummed with its usual rhythm, he found himself walking toward the cafe again. He told himself it was to return something intangible, the truth she deserved, the honesty he owed himself. When he saw her seated by the window, bathed in soft lamplight, it felt like walking into a storm he had already survived once. Her eyes lit up for an instant before confusion replaced it, Reading the truth in his hesitant smile, he sat down, hands trembling slightly, and began to speak, not with excuses, but with sincerity so raw it trembled. He told her his name, his real one, told her about the bakery on Elm Street, the rent overdue, the nights he counted coins instead of dreams. He told her how he had walked into the cafe by mistake, how she had mistaken him for someone he could never be, and how, for one fleeting night, he had wanted to believe he belonged in her world. When he finished, silence stretched between them, heavy yet strangely alive. Lila didn't speak at first. Her gaze drifted to the dessert plate between them, the untouched slice of lemon tart she had insisted he try making, laughing when he admitted he'd never eaten one. Himself. Now it sat as it had that night, perfect but distant, the way truth often feels when it arrives too late. "I should be angry," she finally said, her voice quiet, measured. "But I'm not sure who I'd be angry at, you or the world that makes honesty feel like a luxury." Her words struck him deeper than any accusation could. She rose slowly, gathering her coat with the kind of grace that didn't belong to endings but to pauses. "You shouldn't have lied," she added softly, "but I understand why you did." And then she walked out, leaving him with the faint scent of her perfume and the hollow ache of an unfinished conversation. Days passed. Winter deepened, and the city grew quieter under its weight. The bakery remained open, though barely. A few loyal customers, the hum of an old radio, and Evan's determination holding it together. He tried to forget her, but forgetting someone who had seen through your silence was like trying to unhear music that once moved you. So when the doorbell chimed one gray afternoon and Lila stepped inside, it felt less like surprise and more like the universe exhaling something inevitable. She looked different outside her world of polished marble and boardroom glass. Her hair was tied back casually, her coat dusted with snow. She glanced around the humble shop, the cracked tiles, the handwritten menu, the faint warmth of cinnamon in the air. "So this is it," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "The bakery that feeds hearts, not just stomachs." Evan managed a nod, unsure if her presence was forgiveness or curiosity. The first few minutes between them were awkward, threaded with silences that carried more meaning than words could. She ordered coffee, then a croissant, complimented its simplicity, and watched him move behind the counter, calm, deliberate, utterly real. Something in his authenticity disarmed her. She had spent years surrounded by people who spoke in rehearsed tones, chasing perfection. But here, amid flowered dust and faded paint, imperfection felt sacred. They spoke again, cautiously, tenderly. He apologized once more, and this time she listened without interruption. She told him about the pressure of her father's empire, the loneliness that followed her success, and how his lie had hurt less than her realization that no one else had ever been that honest with her, even in deceit. They laughed quietly at the irony, two people from different worlds meeting in the middle ground of their flaws. The day stretched longer than either intended. When she finally stood to leave, she turned back with a glimmer of something unspoken in her eyes. "You said you're trying to keep this place alive," she murmured. "What if I help you?" Evan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "Why would you do that?" he asked softly. Lila smiled faintly, her tone carrying both mystery and resolve. "Because I believe in kindness," she said, "but on one condition, you'll have to let me change everything." Compassion wears strange disguises, sometimes as business, sometimes as redemption. The offer hung between them like a fragile truce. Lila stood in the soft afternoon light of the bakery, her voice steady yet layered with something unspoken. She proposed that her company's charity division partner with Evan's Bakery for an upcoming corporate event, a project meant to support small local businesses and provide meals to underprivileged communities. It sounded practical, professional, almost detached. But beneath the polished phrasing, Evan sensed sincerity, a quiet need to make things right, not out of guilt, but out of belief. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. His pride stirred uneasily, whispering that this might be pity disguised as partnership. The bakery had been his sanctuary, his mother's legacy, his proof that decency and effort could still mean something in a world that rewarded pretense. Accepting her help felt like surrendering a part of that independence. But as he looked at Lila, her eyes clear, not condescending, her tone warm but firm, he saw none of the arrogance he'd imagined. Instead, there was an earnest hope, a faith in what they could build together if he would just say yes. He took a slow breath, then nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do it." From that day, the bakery transformed into something alive again. Lila arrived every morning, often before sunrise, trading her tailored suits for rolled-up sleeves and an apron that never quite fit right. The air filled with the scent of sugar, yeast, and unexpected laughter. She wasn't there as a CEO's daughter, nor as someone seeking redemption. She was simply Lila, learning to measure flour by feel instead of formula, smiling at her own mistakes as powdered sugar dusted her hair. Evan, once reserved and cautious, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. Together, they experimented with recipes for the charity event. Bread shaped like hearts, pastries filled with stories rather than cream. She brought marketing ideas and structure. He brought creativity and heart. Their late nights blurred into early mornings, and the rhythm between them became something wordless but deeply human. The glow of the oven light painted their tired faces gold, and the clinking of baking trays became their unspoken language of belonging. What started as a collaboration began to feel like healing. Lila rediscovered the simple joy of creating something tangible, something that couldn't be manipulated by corporate spreadsheets or investor calls. For the first time in years, she felt grounded, her laughter genuine, her eyes soft, her hands messy with dough instead of paper. Evan, on the other hand, found his confidence slowly returning. Working beside her reminded him that his craft still mattered, that kindness and connection could rise again like well-proofed bread. He began to look forward to her visits, not for what she could offer, but for the quiet companionship she brought. Their moments together carried a rhythm both tender and cautious. Sometimes she'd watch him knead the dough, the muscles in his forearms moving with steady precision, and wonder how someone so ordinary could feel so extraordinary. Other times, he'd glance at her, sleeves rolled up, face smudged with flour, and realize how beautifully imperfect life could be when lived without masks. As the event approached, their shared work began to attract attention. Customers returned, drawn by the renewed energy of the bakery. Articles were written, photos taken, a story of a small-town baker and a corporate philanthropist uniting for a cause. Everything seemed to be blooming again, like spring after an endless winter. But life, as it often does, has its way of testing joy. One evening, as they were finalizing the last batch of pastries, Lila's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the caller ID and froze. Her father. The name on the screen felt heavier than the silence that followed. She stepped outside to answer, her voice calm but strained. Evan watched through the glass as her expression shifted from surprise to quiet dread. When she returned, her face had lost its warmth. She placed the phone down gently, her eyes meeting his. "He knows," she whispered. "He found out who you are." Evan's chest tightened, though he tried to mask it with calm. "And?" he asked softly. Lila looked away, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke. "He's ordered me to end everything, the deal, the project, and us." Love often trembles between loyalty and truth, and neither path feels kind. Lila had faced boardrooms full of executives, journalists, and competitors who would have gladly watched her stumble, yet nothing ever felt as heavy as the silence in her father's office that morning. The air was thick with polished wood and quiet judgment, the kind that came from generations of power. Her father stood by the window, phone in hand, his reflection sharp against the skyline. When he finally turned, his expression carried the weight of expectation that had shadowed her since childhood. "I built this family's name," he said, his tone controlled but cold. "And now you want to throw it away over some small-town baker?" Lila held her ground, though her pulse quickened. "He's not what you think," she said softly. "He's kind, honest, and he's helping people in ways your company never does." Her father's brow furrowed, his voice deepening into the authority of someone who believed kindness was a weakness. "You're confusing sympathy with love, Lila. People like him will use your heart until it costs you everything." The words stung because they carried the echo of her own doubts. For all her confidence and grace, Lila had always craved his approval,
a rare currency she'd spent her life chasing. Yet now, for the first time, she realized how hollow that pursuit had become. The world he'd built around her gleamed, but it was made of glass, fragile, reflective, and empty. Outside the door, Evan stood frozen, hearing enough to understand. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but fate had placed him there, listening to a conversation that wasn't his to hear yet pierced straight through him. Each word confirmed what he had feared, that his presence in her world was more burden than blessing. He had entered her life by mistake, and now that mistake threatened to cost her everything she valued. When she left the office later that evening, Evan was gone. A short note sat on the counter of the bakery. Nothing dramatic, just a few words written in his careful, restrained handwriting. "You don't owe me anything. Thank you for reminding me what kindness feels like." Days blurred after that. The charity event lost its corporate sponsor within hours of his departure, and the bakery's fragile revival began to crumble. Orders slowed, suppliers withdrew, and the headlines that once celebrated their collaboration faded into quiet disinterest. The oven still glowed, but the warmth felt lonely now. Evan worked through the silence, his movements deliberate, his heart heavier with every loaf he baked. For Lila, the loss was more than professional. It was the ache of unsent messages, of phone calls typed out and deleted, of words that lived only in her chest. She would open his notes some nights, tracing the ink like a map to a place she could no longer reach. The world around her, meetings, deadlines, dinners, continued to spin, but her center had gone still. Then, one winter morning, her phone rang. Her father's assistant spoke quickly, his voice urgent. The company's name was trending for all the wrong reasons: a scandal, an exposé, a sudden storm of public outrage, questioning the sincerity of their charity efforts. Years of crafted perfection were cracking before her eyes. As the board scrambled for damage control, her father turned to her, desperation replacing authority. "We need something authentic," he said. And for the first time, Lila realized the truth. Only Evan's bakery, their unfinished story, could save everything they both stood to lose. Sometimes healing begins where pride ends, in the courage to start again. Lila had faced crises before: market crashes, corporate leaks, public scrutiny. But none had ever shaken her like this one. The headlines splashed across every major outlet, accusing her father's company of hypocrisy in their charity initiatives, tore through their family's pristine image like wildfire. For the first time, the empire built on reputation was trembling, and beneath the panic of boardrooms and PR consultants, Lila heard the faint, steady voice of her own conscience. The solution wasn't another campaign or carefully crafted statement. It was truth, it was humanity, it was the bakery, and the man who had shown her what sincerity really meant. Convincing her father was not easy. He saw only risk where she saw redemption. Yet, as she spoke, her words carried something deeper than persuasion. They carried belief. "People don't want perfection anymore," she said firmly. "They want honesty. They want to see kindness where it's real, not where it's branded." Her father studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded, weary but yielding. "Fine," he said, "you lead it, but if this fails, it's on you." And so the event returned to where it had all begun, Evan's modest bakery on Elm Street. When Lila walked in that morning, the familiar scent of cinnamon and vanilla felt like homecoming. Evan stood behind the counter, surprised to see her, uncertainty flickering across his features. Before he could speak, she placed a folder on the counter. Blueprints, schedules, and a simple proposal. "We're hosting the event here," she said quietly. "Together, if you'll let me." Evan hesitated. Pride and pain warred inside him, but the way she said "together" broke through the hesitation. He looked around at his little shop, walls faded, shelves uneven, but heart still alive, and nodded. The work began immediately. For days they blended two worlds that rarely met, her precision and his passion, her vision and his touch. She organized the logistics, handled the press, and turned the chaos into purpose, while Evan poured himself into the baking, the artistry of it, the soul of it. The day of the event arrived, draped in golden morning light. Cameras lined the street, capturing a story that was no longer about scandal but about redemption. Inside, the bakery had transformed. Garlands of dried wheat and soft lights framed the room. Tables filled with bread, pastries, and warmth. Guests trickled in, corporate figures, journalists, neighbors, and families from the community. Each was greeted not with polished speeches, but with the smell of fresh bread and the quiet hum of something real. As the afternoon unfolded, Lila moved through the crowd, her expression unguarded, her laughter unforced. She caught glimpses of Evan at work, flour dusting his arms, his focus unshaken as he served each guest with the same humility he always had. His story, once hidden behind self-doubt, now stood proudly before the world. When he spoke briefly to the gathered guests, his words were simple but powerful. He talked about second chances, about how love isn't always grand gestures but small acts done with care. He thanked Lila, not as a sponsor, but as someone who had reminded him that hope could rise again, even from failure. The crowd responded with warmth. Journalists wrote notes through misted eyes, and even Lila's father, standing quietly near the back, seemed to see his daughter in a new light. Not as an heir to his empire, but as a woman who had chosen truth over image. By the time the evening sun dipped behind the city sky, the bakery glowed with a kind of sacred joy. The event had not only saved reputations, it had restored hearts. When the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Lila turned to find the counter empty. Evan was gone. The room felt suddenly still, filled only with the faint warmth of cooling ovens. On the work table she noticed a single pastry, a heart-shaped tart dusted with sugar, her name etched delicately across its surface. Beside it, a small note in his familiar handwriting read, "Some things rise best when left to rest." "Thank you for believing." Lila held the pastry close, realizing that love, like dough, needed time, and that perhaps this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something quietly enduring. Absence often speaks louder than confession. The bakery stood silent under the soft wash of dawn, its windows veiled in dust and its door locked with a chain that glimmered faintly in the morning light. The cheerful sign that once read Brooks & Company Bakery now hung crooked, half detached from the rusted hooks that held it. Lila stood before it, hands buried in the pockets of her coat, her breath curling in the cold air like questions left unanswered. The street was empty, the same one that had once hummed with laughter and the scent of rising bread. Now it smelled only of memory. When she looked closer, she saw the notice taped to the window, eviction due to non-payment. The bold letters felt heavier than they should have, as though they carried the weight of every promise that had gone unspoken between them. Her heart tightened. She had all the means in the world to save this place, yet she suddenly understood why Evan never asked her to. To him, help had never been about money. It had been about belief, the kind that couldn't be signed into a contract or printed on a corporate letterhead. What he needed wasn't rescue. It was faith that someone saw the worth in his struggle, not pity for his hardship. Lila pressed her palm gently against the glass, tracing the outline of the interior she once knew so well. The counter where they stood side by side, the table where she first spilled flour and laughed at her own clumsiness, the oven light that had once painted their faces gold. Every corner whispered a fragment of him, his patience, his quiet humor, his way of finding beauty in imperfection. She remembered the warmth of his presence, the calm steadiness of his voice, and the way he looked at her, not as the daughter of a CEO, but as someone human, flawed, and real. Back in her apartment, the emptiness followed her. The city outside continued its rhythm, taxis rushing, people shouting, lights flickering, but inside, everything felt still. She wandered into her kitchen, a place she rarely used, and set down her coat. On the counter lay the recipe he had once scribbled for her, the heart-shaped pastry that had become their quiet symbol. She unfolded the crumpled note, flour smudging the ink, and began to gather ingredients. It wasn't about perfection. It was about remembrance. As she mixed the dough, she found herself smiling through tears. Her fingers moved awkwardly, uncertain yet determined, as if each motion stitched together the fragments of their story. The scent of sugar and butter soon filled the small space, wrapping her in warmth that felt achingly familiar. When she pulled the pastry from the oven, its edges imperfect but golden, she placed it on the counter and whispered, "You'd laugh at this, wouldn't you?" She sat at the table, the soft glow of evening settling in, lost between memory and longing. Her mind replayed flashes of their early days, his nervous smile at the cafe, their shared laughter over burnt croissants, the quiet pride in his eyes the night of the charity event. Every G was a thread, pulling her closer to a truth she had tried to ignore. Love, in its truest form, was not about staying, but about understanding when to let someone find their own way. Her phone buzzed against the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. A message glowed on the screen, an announcement shared through a local business page. Grand opening, Kind Crumb Bakery, founded by Evan Brooks, a small place with a big heart. Lila's breath caught as she read the final line, dedicated to those who believe kindness can rise again. And for the first time in months, she felt something stirring within her. Not regret, but the quiet, certain pull of hope leading her toward him once more. Love often waits where it began, at the same table under softer light. The winter had turned to spring by the time Lila found the courage to visit. The city was beginning to bloom again, but her heart still carried the quiet ache of unfinished moments. She followed the directions carefully, her driver winding through the narrow streets of a small neighboring town until the car stopped before a modest storefront with glass windows glowing golden from within. The sign above the door read Kind Crumb, hand-painted in soft cursive, the edges dusted with flour as though someone had touched it moments before. When she stepped inside, the scent enveloped her. Vanilla, cinnamon, and something deeper, something that smelled like peace. The hum of conversation filled the room, gentle and content, the kind of noise that only belonged to places built from sincerity. The walls were simple, lined with photos of smiling customers, handwritten quotes about hope and belonging, and shelves filled with loaves that seemed to carry more than just flavor. Lila stood quietly near the door, her fingers trembling slightly against the strap of her bag, unsure whether to move forward or turn back. Then she heard his voice. "You came." It wasn't a question, just an observation wrapped in quiet warmth. She turned and saw Evan behind the counter, his apron dusted with flour, his sleeves rolled up, and that same calm steadiness in his eyes. He looked different, not richer or grander, but freer. There was no trace of exhaustion, no weight of proving himself. He moved like a man who had made peace with his own journey. "I saw the announcement," she said softly, her smile hesitant but real. "I had to see it for myself." Evan nodded, wiping his hands on a towel before gesturing toward a small corner table by the window. The sunlight filtered through the glass in warm streaks, falling exactly where it once had in that cafe months ago, where everything had begun with a mistaken name and an honest heart. She followed him there, each step a quiet bridge between past and present. They sat across from each other, the same way they had that first day, but everything felt different now. There were no misunderstandings, no illusions, no walls to hide behind, only truth, tender and unhurried, resting between them like steam rising from freshly poured coffee. "I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to see me again," Evan said, his tone gentle. Lila smiled faintly, tracing the rim of her cup with her fingertip. "You left without saying goodbye." "I had to," he admitted. "Back then I didn't know who I was without the noise, the mistakes, the expectations. I needed to start something that was mine again, from the ground up." She nodded, understanding more than words could express. "And you did. This place, it feels alive." He looked around, pride flickering across his features. "It's not much, but it's honest. Every loaf, every pastry. It's built from the hands of people who just needed a chance. I hire from the community. Some are single parents, some recovering from rough years. They teach me every day that kindness doesn't need to be grand, just consistent." Lila's eyes softened. "That sounds like something my mother would have believed in," she said quietly. "Maybe even something my father's learning now." Evan tilted his head. "Your father?" A smile touched her lips. "He's outside. He wanted to see where I was going. I told him there's someone here who makes bread that can heal a person if they let it." Evan laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I don't know about healing, but it does come from the heart." Their conversation unfolded slowly, like the rising of dough, patient, genuine, full of pauses that carried meaning rather than emptiness. They spoke of the past without regret, of mistakes that had become lessons, and of how life had a way of leading people back to where they truly belonged. Each word felt like a stitch, closing the gap time had left between them. As they talked, the afternoon light mellowed into gold. Customers came and went, their laughter threading softly through the background, but at that table, time felt suspended. Lila looked at him, the modest baker who once sat nervously across from her in a crowded cafe, and realized that love didn't always arrive with declarations or promises. Sometimes it simply waited, quietly, until two people had grown enough to meet again as equals. Outside, movement caught her eye. Through the window she saw her father standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he simply watched them, then slowly stepped inside. The room grew quieter as he approached the counter, the weight of his reputation following him like a shadow. Evan greeted him with calm respect, offering a loaf of bread with both hands, not as a transaction, but as a gesture. Her father hesitated, then broke a small piece, tasting it. Silence stretched. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded once, his expression softening. "It's good," he said quietly. A simple phrase that carried decades of unspoken approval, not just for the bread, but for the man who had baked it, and for the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. Lila's eyes glistened. She looked at Evan, who smiled faintly, humility shining through his composure. They sat together once more, two people who had journeyed through misunderstanding, loss, and rediscovery, finding their way back to the same table that had unknowingly begun it all. As the camera pulled back, the scene widened. The humble bakery glowing like a heartbeat within the city's gray sprawl, the poor baker and the CEO's daughter sharing quiet laughter as her father stood nearby, finally at peace. The story faded on a simple truth whispered in the air between them. Kindness, not class, was what made love endure. If stories like this one still remind you that kindness can change the course of a life, maybe it's worth keeping such hearts alive. One story, one share, one small act at a time. Let's spread the warmth that this world forgets too easily. And tell me honestly, if life gave you a second chance at love and belonging, would you have the courage to take it?